Hello guys, it's time for another short tutorial video. This time I want to talk a bit about seascape photography, focusing on a very certain aspect of it. How to capture breaking waves and how combining several exposures can help to create an even greater sense of energy in the water. So let's start by defining the three major phases you can capture when photographing waves breaking at the shore. First, there are the waves building up in the middle and background. To capture those, I prefer exposure times between 1/8 and 0.7 seconds to blur them just a little bit and to create a sense of motion. Those waves look especially great when lit from behind, which is usually the case if you photograph into a sunrise or a sunset. Then there are the waves breaking at and rushing up the shore. Those can look spectacular if you are photographing a rocky coastline. I use similar exposure times as for the building waves, but I might also go a bit slower from time to time to create more motion in the splashes. Or if the waves are very powerful, I might opt for shorter exposure times to capture the explosive energy. The final phase happens when the water flows back into the sea. To capture this backflow and to create the best dynamic, it helps to have some rocks in the composition around which the water can flow. Plus I try to position myself right in the middle of the flow. Exposure times when photographing backflow are similar to the first phase, but more often leaning to the slower end. And sometimes it's exposure times of several seconds that introduce just the necessary amount of motion. But those exposure times are no recipe, just a little guideline for getting started. The most important thing here is to experiment. There's no one exposure time which is right in every situation, as the examples show. I usually switch the exposure time a lot. I do this first by varying the f-stop between f8 or f13, and here I don't use smaller apertures because of diffraction, and I usually don't shoot more open than f8 because I would lose too much depth of field. So if changing the f-stop alone isn't enough, I can change the ISO, or if I want longer exposure times, I can use ND filters, which besides a polarizer, I consider essential equipment for photographing seascapes. You'll find a link to my equipment list and the filters I use in the description below. Now let's look at a scene I photographed last year while traveling along Australia's east coast. This rocky shore is at Noosa, and the 2 days I spent there I saw lots of great wave action, something this area is famous for. So after finding a composition and setting the camera up on my tripod, I first took some photos to find an exposure setting that suited the scene well. I prefer to use manual mode here, and as the morning progressed I gradually adjusted the settings to keep the exposure time in range. To perfectly time the photos, it's essential to switch off any timers on the camera and use a cable release. If bracketing is necessary, the exposure sequence, which is a camera setting, should be set to first take the normal exposure, which is the one that counts. The dark and the bright exposure can be captured afterwards. But all this technical stuff aside, I then didn't wait for the one photo with a perfect combination of waves, splashes and backflow. I simply took many photos. Here it were around 50 within half an hour. With all those photos, I then had enough raw material to create a photo containing all the elements I needed to show the energy in the water. I didn't need the one perfect exposure here. I simply selected the most dynamic photos and blended them in Photoshop, which is what I will show you now. So here I've already loaded 3 photos of the morning into Photoshop. Those are the photos I will now use and to blend together a more interesting image with a little more wave action going on. So let's quickly look at the photos. So this will be my main layer. It already contains lots of wave action, so I have a nice rush in the foreground, some splashes here in the middle ground. But what I'm missing kind of is a building wave on this side, so there is a bit of it, but it could be a bit more to make it more interesting. So I will use this wave here from the photo I took a little later, and from this photo I'll also paint in a little bit of this side light I have, which looks quite nice, but in this photo itself it's a little bit too much, so I will just blend it in partially. And finally I have a photo with me in the frame, and you can see here there's not that much of wave action going on when I was standing there, so this is something where you always have to be aware of. So if I would have been standing there when this wave hit, I would have been completely drenched. So the first thing I do is I have to align the images, because there might have been a slight shift when I changed the camera settings. So what I'll do, I go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And after this step, which might take a little while on my PC here, because I'm recording video in the back. So, okay, now it's done. So I zoom in a bit. I put a black mask on the two top layers. And I'll start by blending in this wave and bits of the light. And this can be done very easily. So I'll just take a brush with 100% opacity, and the first thing I'll paint in the wave using 100% opacity. And I'll just remove the shape dynamics I have set. So I'll paint this in. This is the main wave I want. And to make this blend more convincing, I now go to like 50% opacity, and I'm again using just the number keys to switch opacity. So with 50%, I paint a little bit around the edges to create a more convincing blend. Also maybe in the back a bit. Might go to 30%, again hitting the number key 3, and do a little more blending. And then 10%. So gradually fading out the blend to the edges. And by this, I get a very easy blend. And next, what I wanted to do, I wanted to paint in some of the light here. And again, I'll just use like 30% here. And again, with white paint on the mask, bringing in very subtly the side light. And making sure that I don't remove this wave. And also here, I'll paint in a bit of the light, and also maybe this splash. And the same on the background. So just very subtly bringing in some of the light, which was there because this last frame was taken a little later than the others, where the sun already rising. I might also paint in some light here and a little more on this side. So this is very easy, and it's just creative painting, so there are no rules here. Just have to be careful to end up with a convincing blend, which is why I'm using low opacities and building up the effect gradually. So a little more. See the before and after. So finally, what I want to do is to bring me into the frame. So again, the first thing is I go to 100% brush and paint myself into the frame. So this is the part which has to be there completely. And now, as before, I go to like 30% and clean up the blend around the edges a bit. So there was even a splash around me when I took the photo, so I want this one in the frame. So I bring it in, I go like 10% now to get a more convincing blend, and maybe paint a bit more in this direction. And I can switch to black with hitting X key and paint a little bit of the splashes back. So just trying to get a smooth transition here, but still making sure that I'm 100% on the frame. So maybe here with like 10%, I'll paint in a bit more, and I can hit Shift and click on the layer to see everything. Okay, and now I paint again with like 10%. But that's basically it. So it's a very easy blend, and I could work a little bit more on it, but for this quick demonstration I think this is not needed. So let's just quickly look at the before and after. So not so much here, just putting me into the frame, adding a wave on this side and a little light on this parts of the image. And you could think of having even more photos, you could add more elements, but we still need to keep it simple. So if you think something's missing, you can add something, but don't put too many waves into the frame. So always trying to get a convincing result that looks kind of realistic in the end. So after this initial blending of the layers, I can then continue with my typical processing, which I show in my more extensive video tutorials. You can find a link in the description if you're interested. Once more, a final word of caution and a reminder to not underestimate the sea. I'll link a video by Brent Pearson below, which shows some of the dangers. I also linked 2 very detailed articles about seascape photography, which I wrote last year. Those 2 articles are a collection of the things I learned the past 8 years of practicing landscape and seascape photography. So have fun on your next seascape shoot.